Hello and welcome to 12 Reasons Why, yet another episode. And I have here Aidan Finn, a Microsoft MVP and a principal consultant with InnoFactor. Aidan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Tushar. So I'm Aidan Finn. I'm based in Kildare in Ireland. I've been working in IT since 1996. I'm an Azure MVP. I've been MVP for 17 years now, Microsoft Most Valuable Professional. Previously with Hyper-V and System Center Configuration Manager. And I work as a consultant with Azure, have been for quite a while. The area in Azure I like the most is networking and networking security and stuff like that.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us today, Aidan. And for those who don't know Aidan is like the master of Azure networking. He's like a guru on all things Azure networking. And we have a really interesting topic today to discuss, Aidan, around Azure Virtual Network Manager, right? So basically, for those who don't know what exactly is Azure Virtual Network Manager, because that's Azure Virtual Networks, we have all heard about that. But what is this Azure Virtual Network thing, manager thing?
Yeah, so AVNM is, I guess the name gives it away, it's a network manager. So if you have lots of virtual networks, so if you're a medium to large enterprise and you're following things like zero trust architecture or cloud adoption framework, you should be building out lots of small virtual networks. So these micro-segmented zero trust spheres of connectivity for your VMs, your PaaS resources, whatever it is, if you're worried about security and compliance, you build up this hub and spoke architecture. Hub is your site-to-site networking, your egress networking to the internet, whatever it is, but it's also for east-west connectivity between your different workloads. And you typically have your firewall there doing your smart stuff and your deep dive stuff, controlling who goes where and all that stuff, and looking for the bad guys. And Azure Virtual Network Manager, the idea is that we can use this to centrally manage all these virtual networks. Not just to manage and simplify the deployment, but then give you some sort of control over those virtual networks. And it's a solution, quite admittedly, when it first came out, it was not ready for the vast majority of customers. It also had sucky pricing. And the pricing model really wasn't appropriate. Again, if you're following the cloud adoption framework, it's not just lots of small virtual networks, it's lots of subscriptions. And AVNM was priced on a per subscription basis, which made it very, very expensive.
Yeah.
But they corrected that a while ago. And only recently the pricing calculator has reflected that change. But now it's a much more affordable solution. And it's, for me, if I was building out a business for myself, and I was using Azure, AVNM would be one of the first things I would actually put in place because it will simplify everything else for me. That's kind of like the summary of what it is at a high level.
Okay. So you said there is a change in the costing perspective, right? So it was earlier like per subscription basis. So now like we can go on per virtual network basis. So
Yeah.
is it like something that you point to, or is it like you deploy one AVNM instance in the whole subscription and it will pick all the virtual networks within that?
So there's a couple of targeting mechanisms within it. So you deploy an AVNM resource, and that's your management interface. And when you deploy that, you can set a scope for it. So you can say,
Okay.
I want to limit your scope of management to this management group, or
Hmm.
this management group and everything inside of it, or this subscription. So
Hmm.
it can be very targeted within that. And then we have the ability to target virtual networks and subnets.
Okay.
Um, so within the management scope, we can say there's a group of virtual networks over here that have some traits.
Hmm.
And we want you to automatically discover any virtual networks that have these traits and add them to a group. And then we're going to do stuff with that group.
Okay.
And with subnets, we can, at the moment, we're limited to statically selecting subnets. We can also statically select VNets if we want as well. But typically, you're dealing with virtual networks. You want to be able to pick up the virtual networks automatically. So if someone deploys a virtual network using self-service, So
Hmm.
a developer or operator has rights to deploy virtual networks. We want to say, right, I'm going to grab that virtual network, bring it into my group, and I'm going to use the other features of AVNM to start controlling that virtual network and bring it into corporate compliance.
Okay. Okay. So it all sounds really great, right? But I just want to understand what exactly is the problem we are solving. So, like, what was the earlier on? Like, we used to manage multiple CIDRs in
Yeah.
our networks, multiple route tables, and everything, right? And how does that AVNM fits into that picture?
Okay, so imagine you have this big organization,
Hmm.
and you're going to have dozens or hundreds or thousands of workloads. And each one, again, you're following zero trust architecture or you're following cloud adoption framework. That means lots of virtual networks. And you're following the true basic concepts of the cloud, which is you are empowering the organization to do stuff for themselves. Now, the big fear of IT is people are doing stuff for themselves.
Yeah.
So they're going to be deploying things, not following good guidance, not having good security, not being able to connect up properly to the rest of the organization. We want to fix that. So the old way we did that was we would give people templates, archetypes, landing zone templates, whatever you want to call them, and say,
Hmm.
use this. Of course, some
Okay.
people would, some people wouldn't.
Okay.
Some people would go and do ClickOps. Some people
Mhm.
would say, oh, your template's in Bicep, I do Terraform. Or I'm an all-powerful developer and I'm able to do all this from Visual Studio.
Yeah.
Or whatever it is. Or an external consulting company would come in and do things their way. And that's perfectly legitimate from an organizational point of view, but the end results may not be legitimate.
Okay.
So they may be deploying a virtual network that has no connectivity to the rest of the organization. So how are they going to do integrations across the network?
Hmm.
Um, they may deploy something on a virtual network, but they're not going through my firewall to egress to the internet.
Yeah.
So how do I stop data leakage?
Hmm.
How do I stop them even publishing things directly onto the internet? Well, I might have centralized web application firewall, so maybe invested a ton of money in an F5 big IP virtual appliance or something, but they're not connected up correctly to be able to use that. And they're starting to turn around and say, oh, we want to have public IP addresses. And it's like, oh, there goes security. Um, so we want to bring, we want to enable people to be able to do things themselves, but we want a good end result. So we can use Azure policy to a certain extent to be
Hmm.
able to, okay, no public IP addresses unless there's certain exceptions put in place. So we can put in that stuff, but how do we do the configuration stuff well? And do it dynamically so we can say, right, if someone sets up a virtual network and it's in this place, it's connected to this hub. So that's the first challenge. So let's say I've deployed an Azure footprint, a hub and spoke in North Europe, so a few miles away from here in Dublin.
Yeah.
And we want, every time they deploy a virtual network in North Europe, I want it to connect to that hub. So what I can do is I can set up a network group
Okay.
in Azure Virtual Network Manager, and I can tell it to dynamically find virtual networks within this management group structure or whatever it is, and it has certain tags in it, or it's got a certain location. So I
Okay.
can start classifying it and say, right, this virtual network, it's got a classification tag that says medium security or high security. Okay, I need to be in control of that. And it's
Mhm.
in North Europe. Right, I'm automatically going to connect that to my hub with peering.
Okay.
So now the developer or operator doesn't have to do any of the configuration for peering. I'm actually going to put the peering configuration in place, and I'm going to correctly enable gateway sharing. So the
Okay.
BGP propagation works, and they can connect to my express route or my site-to-site VPN or whatever it is I may have. Or they can propagate through my Azure root server if I've got a Meraki SD-WAN or something like that. So I have all that stuff now in place automatically. It's the connectivity. I can also extend that concept. So there's another feature in there called connected groups. And this feature is only in AVNM. So there's a few
Hmm.
features we only get in AVNM. So you've probably heard, if you look at virtual network peering, this concept of a mesh, or as I
Hmm.
like to call it, a mess.
Yeah.
So imagine I've got 10 workloads, 10 different virtual networks. And for performance reasons, I need them to peer directly with each other, not go through a hub.
Okay.
That's a lot of peering configurations because every virtual network has to have a peering connection to every other virtual network. And of course, if you've done peering, there's actually two connections. There's one from each side.
Yeah.
Now multiply that all out, 10 virtual networks that all have to talk to each other. That's a whole heap of peering.
That's a mess.
Yes, it's a mess and a mesh. It's a mess of a mesh. Um, Connected groups, I can basically say, hey, these virtual networks that meet these criteria, the search criteria, connect them together. So it'll use the peering technology under the covers,
Hmm.
which is just the Azure Fabric saying these virtual networks are allowed to talk to each other. So it
Okay.
extends the concept of what a virtual network actually is to include more than one virtual network, but I don't have to configure anything other than that checkbox.
Okay.
And bada bing, these virtual networks now talk to each other. And then if they want to talk to anything else, I can say, you know what? They got to go through the hub.
Hmm.
And got to go through my firewall. Now we'll get to the firewall bit in a little bit. So I can start automatically saying all these virtual networks have to go through my hub. That's cool.
Yeah.
So I find a virtual network and it's Brian. Now, how did I find it? So that network group I talked about a few minutes ago, I can statically add virtual networks in there. That's great for a lab. But in
Okay.
the real world, someone could be building a virtual network and I don't know about it.
Hmm.
So I add dynamic members. Dynamic members, when I'm saying, hey, it's in North Europe or it's got other criteria, that's actually an Azure policy that gets
Yeah.
built to discover the virtual networks. And
Hmm.
then it's Azure policy sends a signal into AVNM. And the slow bit is Azure policy actually executing the policy. But as soon as AVNM gets the signal, it deploys the configuration that I set up. So I can have a connectivity configuration. Now, the second configuration that's interesting is the routing configuration.
Yeah.
So in Azure networking, routing is how we do our cabling.
Yeah.
Because by default, every NIC in a virtual network can talk to every other NIC. And if you
Hmm.
pair two virtual networks,
Hmm.
every NIC in the two virtual networks can talk to every other virtual network in the two virtual networks.
Yeah.
So under the covers, there is a mesh. That's the idea of the fabric, because virtual networks do not exist. Every NIC talks directly to every other NIC, and we need to control that. So when we've got a spoke 1, spoke 2, and they're going to talk to each other, we want to go through the firewall. So what we normally did in the past was every subnet, we'd set up a route table. We'd
Hmm.
put in a user-defined route saying, hey, if you want to go to this prefix, you got to go, your next hop is this IP address of a virtual appliance, my firewall.
Yeah.
Um, that's a lot of work, potentially. Now, again, you could do some Azure policy stuff, but AVNM comes along and says, hey, we can do this for you. Very simple. You
Okay.
define a routing configuration. So you define your
Okay.
routing configuration. You basically define all the routes that are going to be in a route table, and you assign that routing configuration to a network group.
Okay.
And then within seconds, every one of those virtual networks or subnets
Hmm.
has route tables configured, which are routes.
Okay.
So imagine the scenario, the developer comes along, builds a virtual network, Azure Policy detects the virtual network and goes, I'm telling AVNM on you.
Hmm.
It's our little rat running around the prison. And tells the prison guards, hey, there's a new virtual network over there. And bang, the cage is dropped.
Totally. Yeah.
So we've deployed the configuration and the route tables with the routes as soon as Azure Policy discovers the virtual network. So we're bringing that virtual network into corporate compliance. And we're configuring the connectivity.
Hmm.
So yeah, the developer is going to be able to reach the other things they should be able to reach, or at least they'll have routes to it. But now we're forcing them through the firewall.
Okay.
So if any traffic's leaving that virtual network, it's got to go through the firewall. So that gives us that granular level control. Now, the third configuration that we have is security or admin rules. So if you're doing virtual networks, you probably have used network security groups or NSGs.
Yeah.
So anyone who doesn't know what it is, an NSG is a free resource in Azure we associate with a subnet or a NIC. No matter how we target it, the rules are actually applied by the NIC under the covers. And
Hmm.
remember, everything in Azure is a VM.
Yeah.
Even so-called serverless computing is executing inside a VM. somewhere in the Microsoft world. So the NIC that's receiving packets or sending packets has these portacles, comes from 2012 Hyper-V. And we can manage those using NSG rules. So we can say, hey, this traffic's allowed, this traffic isn't. And that's managed on a per subnet level. Now imagine I have 100 workloads, and each workload has an average of 2 subnets.
Yeah.
That's 200 subnets, so it's probably 200 network security groups, each with a bunch of rules.
Fair enough.
Okay?
Yeah.
So we'll manage those for our workloads. Now imagine we as an organization come along and say, hey, DevOps or GitHub is not scaling out the way we need it to, so we're going to run our own self-hosted runners.
Okay.
So we're going to deploy whatever method, because there's like 3 methods I can think of off the top of my head, where you can run your own agents or runners inside your network.
Yeah.
That's great. Going to put them in a dedicated spoke. And anyone can use these to execute stuff, and it will reach across the network to deploy stuff to the Azure resources.
That will be a nightmare on network security.
So my firewall rule, that's easy, but all those NSG rules, I had this scenario a couple of years ago. All these NSGs, I have to now add a rule to all of these to say allow HTTPS from this IP range. It's like, whoa! And imagine you're managing that as code. So all the branches you're going to have to create, all the pull requests you're going to have to do, all the explaining to somebody who owns that repo what you're actually up to, or you're doing it by ClickOps, and I say, oh my, that's a boring weekend.
Totally.
And that's where you want one of those Homer Simpson red birds that just taps your keyboard all the time. So the idea here is we can come along with admin rules and say, you know what, I want to deploy a portacle rule to all the subnets or all the virtual networks within a certain scope. So again, I use one of those network groups. I create an admin rule configuration. So I can say, hey, I want to create this rule that says allow this traffic or deny this traffic, or always allow this traffic, even if there's a deny rule in the NSG, always allow it. So I can force my will onto the NSG. And it will deploy out. Now, it doesn't deploy an NSG rule, it deploys an admin rule. Under the covers, it's using the same technology, but it's executed before the NSG rules.
Okay.
So I can put out a rule saying, hey, anyone who's in this network group, you're going to allow traffic from this IP range, HTTPS, and you're going to allow it in. So now my DevOps agents are up and running in minutes, and they're able to deploy stuff across my entire network. Or the other scenario, let's say we have detected malware in an IP address. Well, I can block that traffic from that IP address, sure. But what if I want to do that just to be extra safe across all my NSGs?
Okay.
So there's a certain port I want to block because I want to make sure that malware hasn't spread anywhere else. So I can deploy an admin rule that says, right, if there's traffic of this profile, deny it, and then associate that admin rule with my network group. And it's deployed across all my subnets in seconds.
So if I'm understanding it correctly, like, and I know we had already the NSGs, we have the ASGs on top of that for specific application purposes. So now we are saying the app. So is it actually doing the configuration on NSGs or this?
It's a sister technology.
Okay.
So it's using the same technology under the covers. So it's using those Hyper-V portacles. But it's kind of, I have a few rules that I want to be able to deploy at scale very quickly. NSGs don't get pushed aside.
Yeah.
I have a few rules I need to be able to deploy as a standard across lots and lots of virtual networks or subnets.
Okay.
And it gets executed before NSGs. So it's very select scenarios where you'd use it. Most of the 99.9% of the time you're going to use NSG rules, but there are times where admin rules just will make sense. And you can tell it's limited because you're limited to 100 of them. So it's for very specific scenarios. It's not for, I'm going to replace NSGs with this thing. It's definitely not for that.
Okay.
But it's an extra technology. So if I need to deploy something at scale or I need to deploy something really quickly because it's an emergency, I can use admin rules.
Okay.
So that's awesome. And then the other feature, you ever been in an organization and whether it's Azure or on-prem or whatever, and you're setting up a network or a subnet or something like that, and you go, I need an IP range. Can someone give me an IP range, please?
Yeah, always, every time.
And that causes
That's
delays or
not,
whatever.
yeah, that's
Yeah, I
not
need,
conflicting, and you get some fool giving you the same conflicting range, and you
yeah,
create everything, and then you have to
yep,
turn down everything.
because they haven't been tracking their IPs properly in their spreadsheet,
Yeah.
and because that's where they're probably doing it. So in the on-prem world, we've had this concept of IP address management or IPAM,
Hmm.
and even Windows got involved in that for a while. Windows had an IPAM feature that tied in with DHCP. Um, and IPAM is now a feature in AVNM. So the
Okay.
idea is I can say, right, I have a block of IP addresses that are used by this hub and spoke. So my typical scenario, I come to a customer, I'm building them a hub and spoke. I'll say, right, give me a /16 address space. I'm going to use that for all the virtual networks in your hub and spoke.
Hmm.
And every time I create a virtual network, I will choose a small block out of that /16. So in AVNM, I can come along with that /16 and create an IPAM block. So an IP reservation and say, right, any virtual networks that I'm going to create are going to be taken from that /16. So now here I come along into Visual Studio Code and Bicep, or I come along in the Azure portal and create a
Hmm.
new virtual network, and I can point at that IPAM block and say, give me a /25 or a /24 or a /26, whatever it is I actually need for my new virtual network.
Okay.
And it will take the next available space and reserve it and record that it's associated with this new virtual network in Azure Virtual Network Manager. So
That
it's
sounds interesting.
replacing the spreadsheet and it's replacing the need to talk to someone who owns the spreadsheet. So it's automatically provisioning me the address space. So
Hmm.
now the developer or operator now doesn't need to wait on the network admin who owns the spreadsheet. And,
Hmm.
you know, if they're gone on 2 weeks vacation,
Hmm.
that's a delay for the business. It's not
Yeah.
just the developer or the operator, it's the business that's impacted. So we're empowering that developer or operator to build the virtual network quickly. And then we're putting the guardrails in place to make sure that they're connected up to the rest of the network correctly. They're routing through our firewall correctly.
Hmm.
And we're able to deploy out admin rules on top of their NSG rules if we need to. And we're able to do that really quickly. And that's the power of AVNM.
Hmm.
Is it's giving people that promise of what the cloud is supposed to do. We're empowering people to build virtual networks, but we're going to be in control. The business is still going to have a compliant network. When you think about things like NIS2,
Hmm.
GDPR, we've the new Cyber Resilience Act in the EU coming up as
Yeah.
well. So all these pressures with pressure on leadership, because you look at NIS2, that's all about, hey, if you have a bad cybersecurity in your organization, it's your leadership who are going to get punished.
Yeah.
And it's got GDPR level fines.
Yeah.
And you repeatedly make bad mistakes, some of your directors are going to get banned from being directors.
Exactly. Yeah.
So this tool is helping you build good network security and
Okay.
maintain that zero trust architecture that the national cybersecurity agencies are almost starting to understand. They're a bit slow with their recommendations, but they're starting to get there. Um, the US, I think, is ahead of Europe in that side of things. But yeah, AVNM is all about giving you the promise of the cloud, but giving IT what it needs, which is control and security.
Okay, so one question, and it's been going on since we started speaking about this, right? So you mentioned about a lot of things that we used to do, and I know you are heavily involved in a lot of code projects, so infrastructure as a code projects, right?
Yeah.
So how should we approach the AVNM? Is it replacing the infrastructure as a code bit,
No,
or we are
it's
looking
it's
at?
it's removing the need for some of it.
Okay,
So you think about, oh, I had to do peering. And
yeah.
peering is one of those nasty things in IAC because let's say I'm a developer and I've been given rights to a subscription to build my workload.
Hmm.
So I'm building my virtual network. in my IAC, so in my bicep, my Terraform, whatever it is, I can only deploy one half of the peering configuration.
Yeah.
I can do from the spoke to the hub,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't have necessarily rights from the hub to the spoke.
Yeah.
So what we did in the IAC world was when we built a pipeline, we used an identity and entry
Mm-hmm.
that would execute that pipeline on my behalf. So DevOps, for example, I'd set up a federated identity.
Yeah.
And I'd give that identity rights to configure peering from the hub.
Okay.
But that means I'm starting to have to give away rights.
Correct. Yeah.
And AVNM is like, right, don't need to do that. AVNM is just going to do the peering. In fact, the developer doesn't even have to write the code for the peering. The developer writes the code for the virtual network.
Mm-hmm.
They don't need to know about how the virtual network is going to get plumbed to the hub. They don't need to write the code for the route tables.
Okay.
Because we're not even going to assume that they'll even think about that.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's
Yeah.
about network security. They're
Totally.
not worried necessarily about that. We want to put in the foundational stuff
Yeah.
to say that you want to get out of that virtual network, you got to go through the firewall. And if anyone else wants to talk to you, they got to go through the firewall. So that's what we're trying to do with this solution. Well,
No,
not we, but what Microsoft are giving us to enable us to
Yeah.
build a good network. So it will actually reduce the amount of code we write when we're deploying our workload. And if we're not using code, it's reducing the amount of clicks that I need to do in the portal.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
it's dealing with oversight and forgetfulness, or just bad practice.
Totally agree with you on this, right? Like I have been so many times bitten with this. Like I go in some subscription and what is this network? Like who deployed this? And you don't know. And they have like a public IPs kind of things deployed in that. Everything is going directly outside. So yeah, definitely. So it is going to be working in combination of Azure policies. And
Yeah,
so do we need to do anything on the policies side, or it's just the AVNM resource that we need to worry
it's
about?
just AVNM.
Okay.
Yeah. Obviously, it makes sense. You're going to have other things in Azure policy, like you're going to be controlling, the use of public IP addresses and stuff like that. But I wouldn't be shocked now to see the AVNM people start getting into that space as well.
Mm-hmm.
The team behind AVNM, they're fun to talk to because you say, I really think you should do this or this and this, and they just look at you and they have this smile on their face. It's like they've thought about this. It's on the backlog somewhere. Whether it's up here or down here, I don't know. But every time I've said something, I'd really love to see AVNM do this. Just sit there with a smile on their face and they'll tell you nothing. The best poker players ever.
Oh, it's coming. It's coming. We have thought about it. Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, they're definitely a team that it's a product that, like I said, when it first came out, it wasn't usable. It didn't have enough features.
Yeah.
So it had the peering stuff, it had admin roles, but it didn't have the routing management.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, there was no point in doing peering from a spoke to a hub if I couldn't force traffic through my firewall.
Yeah.
So it just made no sense to me. And as soon as the routing feature was generally available, I was like, right, now fix the pricing, lads. And then they got the message. They got it loud and clear from a lot of people
Mm-hmm.
on social media saying, we love what you've done with the product, but the pricing sucked.
Yeah.
So they fixed the pricing. And still a lot of people who looked at it, say, a year ago and said, okay, the features are there, but God, that pricing, I can never touch that. Like, that's going to be the most expensive thing I have in Azure.
Yeah.
But that's fixed. So there's still a cost, but I look at this thing as like, this is going to help me build a more secure network, and it's going to automate stuff. So it's worth the much smaller cost now. And as I said earlier, it would be one of the things I would say, this is one of the first things I'm going to put in, whether I'm actually going to build it in ClickOps, I can actually deploy it as code. If you look at it as a resource and sub-resource structure, the way they've done it, it's actually really nicely done.
Mm-hmm.
They've used the sub-resource concept.
Okay.
So the network groups, routing configurations, admin rule configurations, the connectivity configurations, IPAM, all that stuff is all dealt with as sub-resources. So you're actually dealing with small little chunks of code,
Mm-hmm.
where there's a parent-child relationship. So it's very, very flexible.
Okay.
And I really like that. You see that sort of thing with Azure Firewall. Having that granular approach to the code makes it much easier to write, much easier to manage. Because
Hmm.
from their perspective, probably means it's much easier to deal with all the internal APIs and stuff like that in Azure Resource Manager. But from a coding point of view, it means you can be much more flexible. Um, and yeah, I like the tool. When I do, community stuff and I show this thing, um, in, half an hour, 40 minutes, I explain the whole thing and demo it from nothing. So there's
Yeah.
a bunch of virtual networks and I'm going to build a hub and spoke with these virtual networks and it's going to be secured. And
Yeah,
they
I have seen
see
that.
that.
I have seen
And
that your presentations, Aiden, and that they definitely like it's really quick and it really like you can manage things. For those who, especially, I got scared of the pricing in last year or so. I believe a couple of months back only the pricing model changed, right?
yep,
So for those who are dealing with Azure from a long time at now, and they have like hundreds of networks deployed, like how easy it is and to adopt AVNM now, and what exactly can be a pitfall in there.
yep. It's very easy to adopt. The thing you probably want to watch out for is your non-standard virtual networks,
Okay.
because everyone has a handful of those.
Hmm.
Well, not everyone, but some organizations will have a handful of those where there's something very custom being done.
Hmm.
So you want to watch out for that. What I would say is when you have an existing environment with AVNM, um, the thing to focus on is the new networks that will come afterwards. You don't have to take over the existing networks. Can you? Yes, you can. But it's one of those things you want to be careful about. Um, so you can come in and take control of peering, for example. So when you deploy a peering configuration, you can actually tell it, erase the previous peering configuration. So you can come in and say, right, that's gone. Here's the new peering configuration. And I'm going to take control of that. Routing, you can come along and you can replace the existing routing. But that's one of those things that you need to be really careful with the routing, because if there's route tables there that have some custom stuff done,
Hmm.
so let's say I've deployed a VNet integrated PaaS resource,
Hmm.
like APIM or something like that, and I've put in 65 routes to make that thing work.
Yeah.
If I come along and replace that, APIM's suddenly going to go, and
You,
someone's going to be very upset.
oh.
So I would say to someone, if you have an existing environment, AVNM, if you wanted to control all those networks, be very careful about doing it.
Hmm.
But I would personally focus on the newer networks that are coming into play. Now, there was an interesting one that actually last August I was talking to someone. I was running a day-long course at a conference in America, and I was talking to someone during the lunch break, and they were saying that they actually had a mesh, and I think it was a ridiculous 90 virtual networks or something like that. It was something mad,
Oh
and it was a mesh, and they wanted to replace that with a hub and spoke.
my God.
And I was like, okay, I haven't talked about this yet in the course, but the thing you need to use is AVNM
Mm.
and gradually take control of each of those spokes using AVNM. Now, at the time, AVNM's pricing wasn't fixed, but it
Hmm.
is now. So, um, build your hub, test it, make sure everything's good, and then slowly start bringing those spokes into the environment. And you could replace the existing peerings using the
Hmm.
new peering configuration. So it remove everything from the mesh and bring it in. Now, you could have done that either slowly, very carefully. You need to make sure that the existing environment is still controlled. In fact, there's multiple ways you could probably tackle that. Now I'm thinking about it more and more. Um, I could even just take control of the whole lot and leave it as a connected group rather than a mesh. And
Hmm.
then slowly say, right, that connected group is going to connect to the hub. And then gradually take each of the virtual networks out of the connected group and then have them as an individual spoke that goes through the hub. That would give me time then to evolve the firewall rules. to make sure that they still have my east-west connectivity the way I'm supposed to. And then you make sure my things like IDPS and threat intelligence and stuff like that are deep inspecting everything to make sure, yeah, the traffic's allowed, but it's also good traffic that's
Yeah.
going through. Um, so yeah, it's a powerful tool, very, very powerful, and something you can actually just get up and running in minutes.
Okay.
But that Greyfield one is an interesting one, and I'd say to any customer, it's like talk to someone about Azure networking who knows Azure networking, and see if the benefits will be there if you're already existing. If your network is big and is static and it doesn't really change,
Yeah.
AVNM may not bring you anything.
Hmm.
It's really for those environments that are a bit more agile, or that are growing for the first time, like you're doing your migration. It's a good time to have something like AVNM.
Yeah. So you will not recommend to just deploy an AVNM and point it to your 600 virtual networks and start doing the routing configuration straight from there.
That
That will
would
be a
break
nightmare.
stuff. That would break stuff.
You'll get the red letter.
Someone's not going to have a job at the end of the week.
No, that's definitely. What's your favorite part about AVNM? So, if you have to pick one thing that basically made you really like mind blowing thing that about
I,
AVNM,
I oh,
one feature, you have to pick one.
oh, you're cruel. IPAM.
IPAM, lovely.
IPAM. For me, it's the whole thing.
Yeah.
It's the vision of the whole thing where it's my governance of networking using a network admin friendly tool.
Hmm.
Like I don't need to be a wizard of Azure policy, because Azure policy, if you use Azure policy all day, Azure policy is logical. But if
Yeah.
you're the sort of person that uses Azure policy once every 3 years, um, Azure policy is a nightmare and it's difficult to troubleshoot. When I
Correct.
say difficult, it's impossible. Um,
It's it takes a lot of time to reflect first.
yeah, because Azure policy is one of these things. If it doesn't work, you change something and hope for the best, because there's no logging.
Yeah.
Really, there's no debugging of it. There is
Yeah.
logging, but there's no debugging. Um, Whereas AVNM is an admin-friendly tool,
Okay.
because it's primarily it's a GUI-based tool that happens to be also IAC friendly,
Hmm.
but it's designed for a network admin or operator.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, I like the solution as a holistic solution. But if you forced me, it's IPAM, just because it solves that
Yeah.
niggling problem. I just need to deploy a virtual network. Why do I need to wait 2 weeks to get an IP address?
That's totally true. I'm waiting a couple of customers at the moment as we speak to give me an IP address range. Yeah, lovely. That sounds totally great. I think that was all my questions you covered in your answers. And is there any specific thing that you want to share about AVNM or any advice?
I would say to anyone, build a few virtual networks, deploy AVNM for a couple of hours. It's one of those things you're not going to break something if you're in a lab,
Hmm.
um, and play with it. And you'll see very quickly how powerful it is. I don't think you even need to read the documentation to understand what it's doing. You can actually just walk through the wizards. That's what I did. Just step through the wizards, and you'll see the thing in action, and it's kind of cool.
Lovely. Yeah. Thank you so much, Aidan. I know you are also on a time pressure here, but thank you so much for joining today, and thank you so much for giving us the time and your valuable knowledge.
Thanks to Shar.